Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. San Antonio's first public housing community opened in 1940, and at that time, many residents had previously lived in homes with dirt floors or no indoor plumbing, so that first public housing community was a big step up. However, nearly 8 decades later, nowadays, units lack basic amenities and even air conditioning in many cases. I'm joined now by Express News investigative reporter Marina Riker to discuss what she's found out about the condition of Alamo City's public housing, and as we'll get into, maybe to how that condition might improve here in the future. So Marina, it's your first time here on the podcast. Thank you for joining me. Let's begin with talking more about the history of San Antonio's public housing, and then we'll work our way up to where we find ourselves today.
Thanks so much. As you said, the first public housing community built in San Antonio opened in 1940, so that was a long time ago. And that was before air conditioning was widely available to folks. So you had several waves of several developments that were built at that time. You had the Alazan Apache courts. You had, I believe, Lincoln Heights and Wheatley courts, which were all communities that were actually some of the first in the nation constructed by HUD. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which these were developments designed to house families who were experiencing poverty and to provide them like decent, safe, and sanitary housing. So that was a big thing, sanitary for folks that had been living without plumbing and stuff like that. But the big issue was, at that point, they didn't have AC. Then they built several more developments back in the 1970s. A lot of those are high rises. They still don't have AC. So it was really only in the kind of more recent developments that you started actually seeing like central air conditioning provided in these developments. And that's kind of where we're at today, whereas 40% of the city or of the San Antonio Housing Authority's stock of public housing is not equipped with air conditioning.
A lot of the conversation today is going to focus right around that, what you just said, air conditioning. We'll get back to that here in a moment. But you said that some of the public housing in San Antonio was some of the first to go up in the entire country. That's really surprising. You know, Texas is not known for these types of services.
Yeah, so back in the day, Austin and San Antonio actually have some of the first. I'm going to say the first wave of development, which, according to housing experts, started roughly in the late 1930s until the mid 1940s or late 1940s. So you had several developments constructed then, and those were, the first housing communities built by HUD and sort of the model of public housing for providing sanitary living conditions to these folks. And basically, Texas isn't, I guess we could say, known for that, but we have thousands and thousands and thousands of public housing units here. It's just that I would say in the last few decades that's when you've seen federal funding for public housing dwindle. And instead of actually building public housing, we're building privately funded housing that is funded by public money, if that makes sense.
We'll get back to the idea of funding for all this with a little talk of President Trump in a moment, but let's jump back to really the topic of the day, air conditioning. And then, you need air conditioning, of course, because of the temperatures. It turns out last summer, Alamo City hit 109 degrees. And at that time, almost 2,400 public housing apartments, which account for, as you mentioned, about 40% of the units, were not equipped with air conditioning. That obviously is bad. No one would want to be in that situation. But it also turns out the last summer wasn't just hot. It was also a bit of an eye-opener. There was an experience that let a Texas state representative kind of know about what's going on, the topic we're discussing right now. It made him want to bring this lack of air conditioning more into the public spotlight. Tell me about that story, and it's still ongoing right now.
Yeah, Yeah. So, and first, I just want to note that people living in these communities generally can purchase their own air conditioning units. It's just that they're not equipped in the unit, but the average tenant in public housing in San Antonio, their income is like $9,700 a year. So when you factor in rent and food and medical bills and all that sort of stuff, purchasing an air conditioning unit, paying for the installation, and then paying for the electricity costs down the line is unfeasible for a lot of these folks. But getting back to the statewide efforts, so last July, temperatures in San Antonio, as you had mentioned, hit 109 degrees. And it was a couple weeks after that that State Rep Diego Bernal was actually at a community meeting at Beacon Hill Elementary School, and he started chatting with a woman, and she explained that she didn't have air conditioning. And as he tells the story, he thought that her air conditioning unit was broken or something like that, but it turned out no, she lived in public housing and has no AC. So he, like a lot of other people, thought that that's not okay. And he ended up kind of roping in several partners, the city, private funders, the San Antonio Housing Authority, which is the agency that manages all the housing, into coming up with a plan to provide like $1.5 million to purchase a window air conditioning unit for each one of these units without AC. So that's roughly 2,400 units. So that plan has moved forward, and they actually might start installation as soon as the end of this month. And their goal is to finish all of that installation, and I think install like 200 to 300 air conditioning units each week until they finish, ideally before it gets really, really, really hot.
To talk about the problem itself a little bit more, what's interesting here is that the law, as would obviously be the case here, otherwise there'd be a huge problem with what's happening. The law doesn't mandate cooling in public housing. And if, in fact, if anything, you could say maybe it even discourages it. So let's move now to how this works. You've mentioned the HUD. There's also Texas entities that are involved in this very complicated system.
Yeah, so of course there's federal, state, and local regulations. And in HUD, on a federal level, they say that all public housing or government subsidized housing needs to have heat, which of course is very important. But they don't require air conditioning, and they've never required air conditioning. So what they actually, in their rules, they say that, which I have the direct quote in my story, but essentially they say that air conditioning that's provided to tenants without them paying the cost should be avoided whenever possible, which makes sense. I mean, that's tax dollars. If you're living in an area that doesn't need air conditioning, it sort of makes sense. But like in places like Texas or Arizona or Florida, where it gets really hot and there's no air conditioning, that can be a big problem. So some states or cities can pass their own laws to say we're going to mandate air conditioning be required to tenants for X amount of months out of the year or whatever it is. But Texas so far has not done that. So on a statewide level, and this is not just for public housing, this is for all rental housing, landlords are just required to provide hot water. Technically some housing advocates would argue that tenants might be able to make the legal argument that air conditioning is a health and safety thing, but thus far, from what we can tell, that has not been challenged, at least to the extent that it would force these landlords to provide air conditioning. So that's kind of where we're at right now, is that there's nothing that says that housing authorities need to do this.
That was a great transition. I want to talk more about health and safety now. As you mentioned, your story, it's available online now at expressnews.com. A lot more details than everything that we can cover on today's episode. While reading that, I was surprised. And then the more I think about it, I maybe shouldn't have been surprised. But at least as I read it, I thought to myself, that's surprising. I was surprised to learn that heat kills more Americans each year than weather hazards. So hurricanes, those huge hurricanes, floods, tornadoes. No, it's heat. And the more I thought about it, you always hear about those stories in the summer months. And then as the climate has been changing in other types of months throughout the year as well. Very unfortunate, and it kills many Americans each year. You spoke with people who live in public housing without air conditioning, as well as some other things. But, obviously that's the focus of this research. I want to know what they told you about what they do. As you mentioned, some people, if they have the means, they could get their own. It's not supplied to them, but they technically have the ability to get it. But if they don't, I mean, it's hot. What does one do?
Yeah, and first, I guess I just want to clarify. So, generally, heat kills more Americans each year. I'm sure there are years where that's not the case, but generally, yes. Like extreme heat, which is kind of interesting because in most states, extreme heat is defined as a 2 or 3 day period with temperatures more than 90 degrees, which I think anyone in Texas can say that that's what we deal with for months on end. So getting back to what tenants do, and it was kind of interesting because I was actually at a tenants council meeting, and a lot of the women who were there were actually chatting back and forth about what they do. So that ranges from putting tinfoil on the windows or sort of like DIY insulation techniques, to literally keeping the front and back door open with all the fans on and sleeping naked at night, to not being able to really cook anything in the oven during the summer. I mean, basically, it just is really, really uncomfortable. And this was perhaps probably the most interesting thing that I saw. One woman, she actually freezes 2 liter bottles with water and then hacks them open with a giant knife after beating them with a hammer to like fashion her own ice cubes because her refrigerator isn't equipped with an ice machine. She has diabetes and has to go walk in the heat to go get a bag of ice from a convenience store. So that's kind of her way of coping with it.
President Donald Trump was recently in San Antonio. You've talked about how federal policy plays into all this very briefly so far when it comes to funding. And I want to try to cover that a little bit more now. What's going on with the Trump administration and money when it comes to public housing?
So I think it's important to note that with public housing, it's not, and HUD will tell you this themselves. It's not necessarily even our current administration. This is decades of underfunding of public housing that has gotten us into the situation that we're in today. So right now, housing authorities don't even have the money to maintain units, let alone provide air conditioning. So what you'll hear from a lot of the housing authorities is that it's not cost effective. To install or retrofit these aging dilapidated units with central air conditioning. They're going to say it's better to actually knock them down and rebuild new ones. But the issue is there's not a whole lot of funding to do that either. So right now, the San Antonio Housing Authority, they estimate their funding backlog is roughly $300 to $500 million. Yet they get roughly $7.5 to $11 million this or each year, to be able to upgrade public housing. So when you just do the math, it doesn't add up. There's just not enough money to really upgrade these units. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And kind of given all that, the Trump administration, at least for this next fiscal year and also the current one that we're in, had initially proposed to totally eliminate the public housing capital fund. That did not happen, and there's probably a very slim chance that that would happen. So, but I mean, that's basically kind of what they are saying that they would want to do, despite all of these issues with public housing that probably desperately need more funding.
And then, so as we're getting ready to wrap up today's conversation, Marina, air conditioning is something that anyone who can get their hands on it is going to want. This is far outside of just public housing. This could just be, low income, other types of situations. Maybe we should focus on that a bit before we say goodbye.
Yeah, so I think that that's kind of the big thing that a lot of communities are going to end up having to address at some point as the climate changes or temperatures rise. At least in Texas, according to 2017 census estimates, there were 113,000 homes that didn't have any sort of air conditioning. So, I mean, this is beyond an issue just in public housing. I mean, this is something that communities all over the state and all across the nation are going to be grappling with as we're dealing with changing temperatures and homes that don't have adequate insulation or cooling capabilities. And of course, there's the public health threat that comes with that.
Thank you to San Antonio Express News investigative reporter Marina Riker for joining me for today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.